What you're about to hear from this retired colonel will shock you. He spoke about technologies that could heal, transmit disease, and even bend space-time itself. Ideas pulled straight from Tesla's stolen papers. It's one of those moments where science crosses into something far stranger.
You know, another area that often occurs in discussions of Tesla is the notion of weaponization of Tesla's true work that's relatively unknown to modern science, but could probably be known to some very sharp people that looked into it because they wanted to make weapons. Tesla certainly spoke of a very large series of very powerful weapons. I think that's a reasonable thing, and let's approach it this way. Certainly I'm on record as saying the weapons exist and that several nations have weaponized them. Let me explain a little bit about what I'm talking about and a little bit key points where you might look. We know for a fact that, for example, T. Henry Moray, with his power supply, was visited by the Russians, and we know that the Russians tried to, in fact, take it. They even tried to kidnap T. Henry Moray. And so we know that the Russians very early on were interested in things like free energy right out of the vacuum, and they were interested in weapons. There are even reports that they contacted Tesla, and I'm sure they would have. He certainly had plenty of headlines. So if we have that then as a starting point, we have a situation where in the late 30s particularly, and just prior to World War II, there was at least some kind of interest in contact. We know in the case of T. Henry Moore, they very probably got the exact blueprints of how to build the device. Maybe a couple things missing in here and there, but a really good lab could have eventually put it together from there. Then comes along World War II, the big interruption for everyone. Okay, at that time, after World War II, we have a very strange situation which exists now. First thing that exists, we have suddenly thrust upon the world scene the atomic bomb. If we had not done so, we would have had a bloodbath when we tried to invade Japan. So many lives were saved by the use of the atomic bomb, and I am not an atomic bomb apologist. Many people who are here today would not be here if their fathers had been killed by the invasion of Japan, and depending on who you believe, the casualties would have been about 1 million on our side alone. Anyway, we arrived at this state in the world where now there's a very powerful weapon which suddenly frustrates one of the things that Stalin has planned to do. Stalin, of course, had a spy in the atomic bomb project. He knew we were getting ready, so it wasn't a big surprise to him at Potsdam when Truman told him that we had just exploded the first atomic bomb. But he had been planning after Europe, after the European War and everything wound down, he would hold his armies for about 2 years. We always beat our swords back into plowshares and go home. Historically, it's the last war, never going to be another one. And unfortunately, human nature doesn't change, and so there is another one. And Stalin, in about 2 years, would keep all his armies intact and simply take over Europe in about 6 weeks. That was his plan. However, now he couldn't do that, because if he massed his forces, we would have bombed him back into the Stone Age. So he had a problem. There is at least reason to believe that Stalin called in his scientific heads when he got back from Potsdam and really laid the law down to them. He said, the destiny of communism has been frustrated by this great new American development. That isn't going to be the last great breakthrough, but I tell you, gentlemen, one thing, the next one is going to be Soviet. So he forcefully ordered them to search for the next great area, in my opinion, to look for that breakthrough. Because thereafter you find Soviet scientists combing through everything. For example, they took the entire scientific literature of the West, loaded on copies onto boats, took it back to Russia, set up huge translations institutes, staffed with very highly qualified scientists, and their job was to go through, look for anything anomalous. The anomalies they laid aside, then they went through them with a fine-tooth comb and to see what looked promising. And, of course, they would have found such things. We've never done anything like that. They would have found such things as the Whitaker Papers, a lot of marvelous things I haven't even found yet that's in the literature that nobody's ever paid any attention to. So my thesis is that that's what happened. They started into this area for building a new superweapon immediately after World War II. Certainly they would have resurrected this Moray stuff they had gotten out of T. Henry Moray's lab through their agent. They would have probably resurrected other things I don't even know about. That's just conjecture, but probably so. At any rate, they did start such a program. The Russians have always been the greatest nonlinear mathematicians in the world. They were at the beginning, they are to this day. And so they would have seen much more clearly into the nonlinear aspects of everything we're talking about than American scientists had seen to date, which means they would have picked up the what today we call the optical type functioning, which means they would have picked up the longitudinal waves. They certainly falsified general relativity theory. Only later, many years later, did they openly publish the fact that it's wrong and show why it's wrong and become, recognized critics of the conventional general relativity. In this country, we did exactly the opposite. We defended it to the last man. So they went much deeper, I think, during this period into these areas than we did. And I think they started building because, as you know from my own previous publications, I put together independently a rather large body of evidence, admittedly circumstantial, but real nonetheless, that can only be explained by the testing of such weapons. There is absolutely no other explanation for it. Now, I could be wrong on one incident, but 200 of exactly the same kind, I think not. So the evidence is overwhelming, and you even hear now their own leaders, like Zhirinovsky recently has referred to these weapons as the ellipton weapons. There is no question today that the Soviet Union has these weapons. And if what I put together is correct, and I'm absolutely convinced it is, 3 other nations of the world also developed those weapons and resoundingly checked the Soviet Union. The other 3 are friendly to the United States, not hostile. And I think that played one great part in the fall of the Soviet Empire, because their original target date, as I brought out, had been 85 to achieve the freedom to move and do what they wished in the world in 1985, and they met the schedule, as I've adequately reported. But once checked, then we have a very strange situation. Now communism falls because of its financial shortcomings, and they just flat can't keep it glued together anymore. And in the dissolution here, we have entered what I think is a much more dangerous world than anything we ever thought of. 3 other nations today are indeed working on what I call the Tesla weapons, or really scalar electromagnetic weapons. And these nations are not really friendly to the U.S. at all. So it's a much more dangerous world that has emerged. The nuclear control that was executed by the Soviet Union is now probably been diluted. You can hire, if you're careful, you can hire some Soviet scientists right off the project. Many nations today are developing nuclear weapons, and they don't have to go through the pain we did. They're hiring people who already know how to do that and have done so. So very shortly, you will see emerging throughout the so-called Third World, as it's so loosely referred to, you will see nuclear weapons. You will see the extended Scud, for example, being developed in North Korea, aided by the Chinese, and is being expropriated to the Mideast. And in my opinion, you will see a nuclear and biological warfare in the Middle East in 3 or 4 years, somewhere on that time range. I could be off a year or 2, but it isn't going to be forever. So to me, it's a much more dangerous world that we live in, particularly if we see the advent, in addition to the nukes and the biological warfare, which is certainly frightening enough, if we see the advent of several other nations now possessing weapons of the ilk and power spoken of, although it a little bit obliquely, by Nikola Tesla. I would like to explain the basis for the weapons, because it's open. If you take the 2 papers by Whittaker that I'm so fond of quoting in all my stuff, you will find that the first one tells you, if you do it in reverse, tells you how to make, if you wish, a scalar beam by simply assembling the necessary wave set. The second paper will tell you that if you then take 2 such scalar beams, actually hidden multi-waves, and interfere them at a distance, yes, scalar interferometry really exists. It's just really multiple wave interferometry when you understand the wave sets. What will occur at a distance will be the reappearance of the electromagnetic gradients, which we call force fields. In other words, you'll create the electromagnetics at a distance. If you bias your ground potential of your transmitters higher than the distant focal point, what we call energy, heat energy, exhaustion of energy, which should be called work. Heat energy will emerge in the other area and scatter at that area. Energy will go in here and scatters work out the other end. It's just like you had a direct pipeline at a distance. Is this indicative of Tesla? Of course. If you bias your projectors the other way, the energy flows in the other direction. In other words, you extract energy from out there, and the energy, you have to do something to collect and dissipate the heat back at the transmitter end. Every transmitter is now a two-way transmitter of energy. I can make it go in one direction by biasing or go in the other at will. The weapon implications of that alone are extremely frightening and extremely powerful, and now several nations are involved in developing it right straight forward to the hilt. Very shortly, we will have an even more frightening world emerging. The other thing you can do with it, which I think Tesla alluded to at least in a few cases, when you do these things with the potentials rather than with the force fields, you actually involve time. You produce time effects, or you can produce effects on anything that exists in time because you affect the time dimension. When you do this, you can affect thought and you can affect human beings where they live, because thought occurs in time. It occupies time. It's just not spatial, but it is time-like. As you can probably see, if indeed the world has already acquired, several nations, the ability to build the defensive weapons in the area that has been discussed here, the Tesla-type weapons, then there's really no longer a great compelling need to do any further weapons work by any private citizen. So there are some other very compelling areas, however, of great need for humanity that are directly involved with Tesla's approach and Tesla's work that cry out for research and development. Two of these areas are fantastic. We must have clean energy sources. We must have some source to provide our needed electrical power cleanly and freely without polluting this entire biosphere. Everybody's concerned with that. The way to do it is not to put in harsh laws that stop all workers and everything like this and go into absolute dictatorship. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to do it scientifically by striking for a great new breakthrough to where it can be done, and done cheaply and cleanly. So that's one area that, you know, is important and deserves the utmost effort that can be put on it. Another area that is assuming ever more increasing urgency is the area of the medical needs. Allopathic medicine is failing. The bugs are all changing, and they're becoming immune to all our antibiotics. The orthodox scientific people are saying this openly in their journals and their articles and their editorials. Even the newspaper and Newsweek and so forth are picking it up and writing articles about it. Within 5 years, you will have a serious risk of your life, if this trend continues, just to go to the hospital. The number's already over 10,000 per year. I don't know the exact number since '92, but it's already well above 10,000 per year that die in the hospital because the infection that they have absolutely cannot be controlled. There is one kind of staph, for example, that nothing that we have will affect. And it has about a 30% lethality, I'm told. So 3 out of 10 who contact that die in the hospital. These kinds of things are increasing. You now have very well recognized scientists in the regular medical scientific community saying allopathic medicine is failing, and there's nothing to replace it. You cannot develop the vaccines or new compounds fast enough to even keep up with them. We have lost that battle. We must change the medical approach. The medical approach, if you use the extended electromagnetics, if I may use that term, that Tesla was talking about, there then occurs phenomena which can be used to control and change and heal almost any infectious disease whatsoever, including a genetic disease such as where the genetics have changed in the cells, such as AIDS. Now, that is not an idle statement. That is a very rigorous statement based on some very rigorous scientific work done in France in the late 60s and early 70s by Antoine Priori and a team of scientists that gathered and worked with him. And these were eminent scientists, world known. For example, one of them was Robert Courier, head of the biology section of the French Academy of Science, and also the secretary perpetuel of the French Academy at the same time. Potrezel, an eminent scientist, world known. Many such scientists worked directly with the inventor Antoine Priori. Priori completed his doctoral thesis, which was rejected because of the violent opposition of the medical establishment. But he demonstrated under rigorous scientific protocols that you could completely cure, almost with ridiculous ease, terminal tumors in lab animals. He did it hundreds of times under all the proper rigid controls. I mean, Courier personally sent his own personal assistant to do the tumor grafts and ensure that everything was absolutely impeccable. Very simple. You take 15 rats, 30 rats, 15 each, one control group, one test group. All the rats get inoculated or grafted with the same terminal tumor. They're going to be dead with 100% certainty in 30 days. The 15 get treated, the other 15 don't. They stay in exactly the same room, same food, same everything. The 15 treated all get well. The 15 not treated all die, with another provision. You can then take another group of 15 rats with the same tumors grafted to them. You can take one drop of blood from each of the rats that got well and put in each one of the other rats, and they will all get well from that single drop of blood. The ordinary medical establishment was furious. When they changed the setup of the French government to a leftist government in the mid-70s, the Priori team was just completing a very large installation with permission to treat human patients with terminal cancer and leukemia and so forth. Now, he surreptitiously treated some humans before and cured their cancers and leukemias. The problem was nobody could understand how it worked. We didn't even have at the time the knowledge of this new parts of phase conjugate optics that we needed to understand it. It's no wonder they couldn't understand it. Nobody could. And so when they suppressed that, they withdrew the funding from the project. It was funded by the French government. And when the government changed, they withdrew the funding. All the work ceased. The equipment later was destroyed. Priori later died. At any rate, this is something absolutely legitimate. It did use the type of electromagnetic extension that I've talked about. And if we open up that extension, there now is the explanation available of how it worked. And yes, we can cure such diseases if a proper scientific development program can be mounted and funded. And it will all be based in part upon the work of Nikola Tesla. Often there's been a great curiosity about this strange thing the Russians suddenly injected onto the world. They had done some pre-testing, but suddenly on July the 4th, 1976, for a bicentennial present for us, the Soviets opened up some great new transmitters in the communication band, which, because of the chirping sound and the sound just like a woodpecker's bill hitting a block of wood, was immediately dubbed woodpecker by all the ham radio operators who had it interfering with their communications. And so this was really massive communication, massive transmitters, lots and lots of power. And nobody could figure out what in the world was going on. It made no sense because certainly the signals as seen could do over-the-horizon radar work, which you normally put in that same frequency band. But there were also apparently lots of characteristics which didn't fit what you would do if you were designing something that was just over-the-horizon radar at all. There would be no need for such complexity. So there's been a lot of discussion on it, and, I guess the official realization was that, or calling it, was to say it's just simply over-the-horizon radars. Well, they built a lot of them. But if you look at it through the eyes of the scalar interferometry, and I mentioned the two references and have cited them in various papers, there are other work along that line too. If that approach is used in what seems to be what Tesla had done, if you use the Tesla approach to interpret it, now one is dealing with scalar interferometry and dealing with something that can do some rather astounding potential weapon effects. With the Tesla interpretation, one of the things that would result from that line of weapons, assuming they are used as scalar interferometry weapons, one of the great things that would emerge from them would be to produce controlled energy at a distance. For example, great huge balls of controlled electromagnetic energy, or if you pulse it, great blasts of electromagnetic energy at a distance. I mentioned the business of biasing the transmitters, where you can produce either heat, like an explosion, or you could produce a cold explosion, the sudden explosive withdrawal of energy from the distant area. And in books cited incidents that are representative of what one would find if those incidents actually were occurring on that kind of scale. The incidents are there, they're real, they're documented, they're not just Tom Bearden. So there is a good solid set of admittedly circumstantial evidence that the woodpecker signals, because of all the phenomena that can be associated in the same time frame since they turned on, these phenomena very strongly suggest that this set of weapons is not just over-the-horizon radars at all, but are really Tesla weapon systems. And if they are, all the rest follows. They have one other frightening area, if this thesis is true, that is almost mind-boggling. There is a Soviet physicist, scientist named Kosnashev. And Kosnashev has produced a series of experiments in 2 Soviet military institutes before the fall there that showed that you could transmit any sort of disease form between cells. Any sort of infectious disease, or you can radiate one sample with nuclear radiation, gamma radiation, for example, or deadly poison, or infect them with viruses. You can transmit between cellular cultures into another cell, another sample from the same culture, the same disease electromagnetically, although the organisms won't necessarily be there. That works in literature if you pursue it. Kosnashev has several books out now that are available since the Russian system has loosened up a bit. That work has been replicated at the University of Marburg, for example, in Germany. It has been replicated at the University of Sydney in Australia, and it has been replicated by at least one researcher here in the United States. He's trained to say if there are no force fields, there's no electromagnetics. He ignores the potential that's left. He just sweeps it away and throws it away. From where we're coming from with the Tesla approach, that is the active part. That's the part that is being interfered within the bodies or whatever to cause whatever you wish to cause. If we couple it with the Kosnashev stuff, we are saying that such scalar transmitters in interferometry within the U.S. Embassy could indeed have produced any sort of disease they wish. However, it would have very strange signatures. Let me explain the signatures and how such signatures actually came about. First of all, when Nixon went as vice president to Russia, and this was first detected, he was going to visit some nuclear installations, and they carried Geiger counters, and it was detected on the Geiger counter. It's an ionization device. It detects the ionization and discharge of its own gases, and anything that will ionize its gas, it will detect. It doesn't have to be nuclear radiation. And so they thought at first that it was deadly nuclear radiation because all the counters went off. Indeed, it was not. They were irradiating the president with this stuff, with the Tesla stuff, to see if we knew what was going on. That's a beautiful intelligence probe. You pick out a high-level target like the president or, the embassy. You radiate and do some things that are obvious, not too bad, but are obvious, so they can't be missed. And then you see what happens when the system goes bananas trying to figure out what's going on. And by their actions, there's no way to fake it. You either tell them you know what's going on by your action, or you show them you don't know what's going on. There's no way to get out of it. It's 100% certain, which very few things in intelligence are. However, if I go back to the embassy where many health changes and diseases and so forth, 3 ambassadors died of a leukemia-like illness eventually. These diseases occurred only within the embassy in those areas where the force fields were absent and the potentials were there. And the Johns Hopkins researchers did a beautiful job. They were expert guys of establishing the force field electromagnetic pattern, and since not a single case occurred in that area, that's by the normal electromagnetics, then reached the conclusion it therefore could not possibly be the microwave radiation. Actually, that's a false conclusion. If the radiation played no part whatsoever and you had that many changes occurred, the odds are extremely high that some of those would have occurred in the area where there were force fields and some didn't. Since that did not occur, it is a 100% correlation to the Tesla area, to the area where the potentials existed and the force fields did not. And I'm sorry, they reached exactly the wrong conclusion because the model they applied failed them. These were able scientists using only the conventional model, and the model actually showed that it was the other stuff, but led them to conclude, properly for their model, that it couldn't possibly be the electromagnetics. That's just one incident. So the woodpecker then would be able to apply because of so many signals, the scalar stuff we might not even see with our normal detectors, but yet it could do exactly the same thing, for example, in the United States alone. Now, what does that imply? If we are not too far out into left field here, if there's really a ground, as I've tried to describe here, if there really is a theoretical ground here for the use of those weapons in a Tesla mode and the use of the Kazanashiev knowledge and experimental results in here, apparently confirmed by what happened in the U.S. Embassy, then those radiators, which are active to this day, not in the conventional sense, you've got to have a different detector, those radiators could conceivably create, within a mass population, almost the instantaneous spread of mass diseases of all kind. They would be anomalous. You'd be dying, for example, of bubonic plague, and you wouldn't have the organism. But it represents, if that part is true, it represents a biological weapon of incredible implications for population warfare. I hope to God I'm wrong. I don't think I am. One of the questions for anybody who tries to take the Tesla view and tries to do it anywhere halfway scientifically, one of the questions that certainly comes out of all this other work on what kind of possible weapons could have been built and what possible uses and demonstrations have been made, the question emerges, what about warfare in the future? Well, what I can do is give you my opinion and leave it up to each person to evaluate that as they see fit. We have certain trends, however, that certainly are possible. We see with certainty other nations developing nuclear weapons. Shortly, almost everybody that wants to have a nuclear weapon and is a nation of any little size at all is going to have one. I would characterize that by the fact that weapons of mass destruction have now passed out of chess-playing hands, in other words, logical hands, into some hands which are irrational. And to me, that's a much more dangerous world. There is another thing. Suppose, the fear all analysts have is the suitcase delivery system. You simply slip in the weapon parts and assemble it, say, in New York City or Chicago or someplace. And perhaps the next time the U.S. decides to intervene somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere, the terrorists then blow several of these weapons. Incredible damage to the United States. This would suggest an area where not only have the great nations been involved in strategic deterrence, if I might use that term, which is now falling out of fashion, but all the small nations, or a lot of them, will be able to provide a very positive strategic deterrence to even great nations by the threat of nuclear warfare, clandestine warfare as I described, or biological weapons which are cheap and everybody can have and build. It is certainly a much more dangerous weapon that has emerged, world that has emerged, and the weapon spread now is just, it's seeping out just like a torrent. There's no stopping it in these kinds of weapons. One doesn't know what will be the future in the slow leakage that seems to be going on in the Tesla weapons. Certainly, it simply adds to the pile at the very best for us, the threat. And at the worst, it adds an impossible threat. So the world is facing a set of dangerous possibilities, dangerous threats to us all, to everybody, to every man, woman, and child, because the civilian population is no longer immune or even exempted from these kinds of things. We're facing a world of possibility of multiple nations, multiple kinds of irrational groups being able to apply enormous weapons of enormous implications to even the civilian population. Our military, for example, is facing a situation where, with a lot of development in biological warfare, if suddenly new agents that you have no knowledge of whatsoever are thrust upon you, you have no antidotes, you have no effective methods of treatment, and these are fairly rapidly acting agents. Let's say they kill in 2 days. Rapid infection, I'm just taking an example. You couldn't possibly come up with anything to do anything with the normal stuff during that time. The only alternative will be the extended electromagnetic treatment, because then you could treat it without identifying the agent and cure it before it even came out in the illness in your troops. Otherwise, even your military forces face decimation by sudden unknown agents which they are unable to counter. So surprise attack becomes an ever more dangerous thing in a lot more dangerous hands. The world is much more dangerous today. For a much more positive application of, shall I say, Tesla's extension to electromagnetics that he was using, though not technically describing so well, something that's much more beneficial, or can be, to mankind, humankind, rather than destructive means, one should focus on the imminent advent of practical over-unity electromagnetic devices. These are devices which can be closed-loop to run themselves and produce useful power in the load. For one impact, which is highly beneficial, it's obvious to the most casual observer that the use of such systems, where the power to run it is actually extracted from the vacuum itself, if carefully used, there will be no damage to the biosphere, and we will certainly eliminate an incredible amount gradually. It won't happen overnight, but we will gradually eliminate an incredible amount of burning of fossil fuels. There's still a need for all the fossil fuels, only not as fuel. The chemical needs alone for medicines and materials and so forth to benefit mankind are enormous. But certainly we will stop all the exhausts and pollutants from the burning of those fuels from entering the atmosphere. It just won't be happening anymore to the extent it is now on any scale. It will allow us to take funds, for example, on something like into what I like to think could be a more sane world, and a much more protective of the environment, of our children and of our children's children. Now, in all candor, I must add one danger if unrestrictedly used. When you produce excess energy of this type from the vacuum, right in the vacuum, in a local area, if you produce a very large amount, particularly if you do it very suddenly, in that region you have a curvature of local space-time. And there can be biological effects from that we are presently not quite capable of fully explaining or knowing. There's going to have to be some careful incorporation of the devices so that we use care. We do not inflict any kind of damage on anybody or anything like that. So with reasonable scientific care, we can prevent any such thing, and we should do that. We should incorporate such systems into our normal utility transmissions across the lines. The lines are there. The maintenance of them is already there. The facilities are already there. They're already connected to the homes. It would just be nice if gradually we didn't have to burn so many fossil fuels, and gradually the power price could come down cheaper and cheaper, but meanwhile everybody stays working and everybody stays involved. But what we really wish to eliminate is, say, an older person in New York City, cold in the winter, very limited income, can't pay the utility bill very well, so has to keep the power down, freezing, eating dog food. We must do better than that, and we can. And the Tesla technology will allow us to do better than that. So it must be done.
You what, mate?